This podcast is part of the Spoon Podcast Network, home of smart conversations that feed your mind.
Well, welcome to yet another episode of Watch What You Eat with Carolyn O'Neill. I am your host, Carolyn O'Neill, registered dietitian. And, we talk about all kinds of things from pate to pesticides. But really, our goal is seeking the very best in food, nutrition, and cuisine. Today, my guest is Jaclyn London, who is also a registered dietitian and really, bravely specializes at the moment and always has in nutrition myth busting. Now, what we're talking about here, folks, is the fact that everything you read isn't true, everything you hear isn't true. And of course, in food and nutrition, it's a wild, wild west. It always has been, and it still is. And Jaclyn, before I go through your amazing bio, so this is still happening. Still a lot of nutrition myths to bust.
I think it's happening more than ever. First of all, Carolyn, thank you for having me. I'm such a pleasure to be here, and I love seeing you and chatting with you. So thank you. But truly, I think we've actually reached fever pitch. I think this has got to be the pinnacle, at least in my lifetime, of what I've seen, and certainly since I've become a practicing dietitian, it's the pinnacle of what I've seen of rampant misinformation and confusion and blatant, convenient theories for you that become, so to speak, evidence-based reality, which they, of course, are not.
All right. So now you've just heard the voice of Jaclyn London. And, for folks, does that name sound familiar? Well, Jaclyn London actually was the actress, one of the original Charlie's Angels of the three. And so you really are our Charlie's Angels of nutrition myth busting. I just wanted to give you that little moniker because you're out there really battling away at the bad guys, if you will, and just the bad information. Now, to give you a little bit of background, of course, I mentioned that Jaclyn is a registered dietitian like I am. But listen to this. She is the author of one of my favorite books. It's called Dressing on the Side. Who hasn't done that to try to save a few calories? And other diet myths. Maybe you don't have to have it on the side. Thank you for that. We'll talk about that a little bit too. But Jackie actually was head of nutrition and wellness for WW, remember, Weight Watchers. And again, gold standard for good information on everything from pajamas to what you put on your plate, good housekeeping. And Jaclyn was the nutrition director responsible for the brand's nutrition-related content and good housekeeping. That's amazing. We talk about the good housekeeping seal of approval. We dietitians, of course, give our seals of approval. You formed one when you were at Good Housekeeping for the nutritionist approved emblem. And then, of course, a great background in clinical nutrition and helping patients, helping clients solve their, whether it's related to a diet-related disease or just weight management. Again, in nutrition, it is seeking the very best to help people reach their optimal goals. All right, so what's getting in the way? What are you seeing on social media right now that just doesn't seem like people should be believing it?
If I had to give you a theme for everything that I feel like is happening right now, I would say there's a lot of majoring in the minors. There's a lot of focus and attention on very minute details, substances, compounds, agricultural practices, food additives being a perfect example of this, which is not ultimately helpful to people. And I say that because in fact, we do have, and I'll just use food additives being the perfect example, but you could say the exact same thing about things like pesticides used in agricultural production. When we put the focus on these things, we're taking away from the overall patterns that actually help people fundamentally live a healthier lifestyle and eat more nutritious foods. So you can take one type of additive out of an ultra-processed packaged food, but ultimately, if you haven't changed the nutritional composition to become a real whole food, then what have you actually done that helps consumers make more health promoting choices for themselves and for their families? And again, like I said, the pesticides are the same thing. There's this focus on conventional farming systems and how this is quote unquote bad, whereas many people don't realize that organic farming systems require the use of pesticides as well. They're just USDA organic pesticides. And these distinctions come at a cost because we wind up feeling paralyzed. We wind up feeling so inundated and overwhelmed by information that it becomes almost impossible to make choices for ourselves and for our families. And I've got to say, Carolyn, I feel like I'm seeing more and more physicians who maybe otherwise would push back against some of these claims, like in a one-on-one setting, but find themselves feeling a little bit like, wait, everyone's talking about the pesticides. Are they bad? Like things like that we used to accept as something that most of us believe to be true. I think if I had to put it into a more succinct sentence, I would say that consensus is ultimately what we're looking for when it comes to evidence-based nutrition research and not controversy. So if something sounds really controversial or sort of out of left field, it probably is.
I think, when you mentioned additives, okay. And, in the news right now. And, oh, by the way, folks, we are recording this on April Fool's Day, which I absolutely adore. You may not be listening to it on April Fool's Day, but we're going to talk about some April Fools and how we can prevent you from getting fooled. All right. So this whole thing about like, if you can't pronounce it, it's not good for you. Okay, first of all, vitamin C is ascorbic acid. I know that the word for vitamin B12 is a little mispronounceable even for me. So that just can't be true.
It's wild. This is a wild one. The whole ingredients you can't pronounce thing really begs the question of it makes me wonder something that I often think about as it relates to nutrition. I have never once thought to myself, you know what? My degree, my master's degree in nutrition makes me equipped to fly a plane. So I'm going to tell this pilot to step aside and say, you know what? I got this. I have an MS in nutrition, so I know how to fly planes, right? That doesn't make any sense. I have no idea. And I don't have the hubris to be able to do that, right? It wouldn't even occur to me. It makes me confused when people who assume that if they cannot pronounce a nutrient or perhaps in the case that you outlined, a nutrient like cobalamin, cyanocobalamin.
Woo! What is that? That sounds so scary.
Right? Vitamin E, right? These are hard words to pronounce. And that the assumption isn't a limited literacy of nutrition science, but that the assumption is that everyone else is wrong and that the fact that this is in our food supply is dangerous. And I just think we need to take a real step back. The nutrition is a science. And I think part of what gets lost in this conversation about the foods that are unsafe because you can't pronounce them is that our nutrition literacy in this country is so low. And not even in this country, around the world, nutrition literacy is low. It's deprioritized. It's not thought of as, the most important thing. And why? Because it doesn't really align with high profit interests of any industry. It often is antithetical to high profit industry. So it's something to consider because we are often the people who are saying, not so fast and being overruled simply because profits over public health in most of the Western world, but predominantly in the United States. So I think we have to come back to the idea that nutrition literacy is not common, but that doesn't make it scary or bad. Not being able to pronounce ingredients could very well mean that there's just another name, a biochemical name for something that you're consuming, or it could very well mean, my dad who passed away in 2018, his favorite thing was to make fun of me and say, "Oh, you're going to tell me to eat quarain." He couldn't get quinoa. He wasn't going to get quinoa. And you know what? It's okay. It's okay. He didn't have to. As long as he ate it, I was happy,
And as long as there's Google out there, folks, if you see a word that you can't pronounce or aren't familiar with, Google it. There may be an explanation that carrageenan, is actually from seaweed. And I thought you wanted more natural products. Oh, and by the way, I cannot pronounce Worcestershire sauce.
Impossible.
Okay. But anyway, we'll move on from that. All right. The other, I think, I'd love for you to talk about, there's sort of the health halo that goes on some foods, like anything you put a blueberry in apparently is good for you. And then anything you put sugar in is going to be bad for you. But tell me how you explain to people what processed foods or ultra processed foods are, because that has really become kind of the Darth Vader, if you will, of the food dialogue today.
This is such a good question. And I have to confess that I really struggle with it. And I have to say that I honestly find myself sometimes slapping myself on the wrist for using the phrase ultra processed packaged food because we actually don't have a definition for it yet. Right. I mean, we have the foundation for determining a definition at some point, but we really don't have a clear definition that's scientifically validated and that makes sense to most people, because we know that things like canned chickpeas are going to be technically a processed food. They may even be by current wonky standards that are somewhat fabricated. They may even be ultra processed, but they are a nutritious food. So when I use ultra processed packaged food, I tend to be using it in the shorthand of saying things that are high in added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium, because they're able to sit on a shelf for a prolonged period. And that is the main function, aside from flavor, of course, aside from flavor enhancing. The main function of adding those three nutrients is often to maintain shelf stability so that things can stay on a shelf for a long period of time and be sold in all locations. It really makes it that much easier for you to find these products at retail versus real Whole Foods, which are often found, they may not travel. I not to take us on too far of a tangent, but I met someone recently who was a pear grower in the Northwest and was speaking about how pears are divas. And if you, let's just love that phrase, that pears are divas. And if you are handling them wrong, incorrectly, they wind up ruined, right? Because they're so susceptible to oxidation and to spoilage. So it really makes sense, right? You want food that you can eat as close to nature as possible. That's typically how I find myself defining it. And when I say that, what I'm really looking at are the foundations. What are the things that are actually just food, things that you can recognize, things that you put together, everything else. And this is why I say we're majoring in the minors, is because focusing on some of these additives, focusing on some of these other factors that play a role in our current food system today, they're not providing necessarily nutritive value. They're not providing actual nutrition value. They're often things that are added to enhance color, flavor, texture, but they're not exactly what make or break the nutritional quality of the food itself. It's really about not just the additives that are in there, but the fiber, the antioxidants, and the whole foods, the water, the vitamins and minerals that are going to be in real whole foods. So it's not just about what you're eating, it's about what you're not eating.
Very good. And, you mentioned 3, I guess, I would call that, I don't want to call it, they're definitely not the villains, but they are what to limit and what to set tolerance on. And you mentioned sodium, saturated fat, and sugar, which brings me, so we should limit those things because we know they're connected to ill health, essentially diet-related diseases, whether it's high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, all that jazz. But that doesn't mean that they are, another favorite word, a toxin.
Oh, yes. Such a good point. I think we really have to we really have to get back to basics on this one. What makes anything toxic is the amount that of which you consume it. It's the main factor. The ultimate thing that makes anything toxic is how much you consume of it. And I always bring it back to this point about vitamin A supplementation. And we know from I think it was the SELECT trial that found the causation, that actually found causation between high doses of vitamin A and lung cancer in smokers. If something that we know to be an antioxidant, something that we know is beneficial for our health, can be, when consumed in high dose supplements, something that is toxic for our bodies, that literally causes cancer, then we have to assume that just about anything that we consume can be, in one form or another, toxic. But the amount and the concentration and the frequency with which we consume something is ultimately going to be what makes something into toxic versus health promoting.
Absolutely. I always think of sugar as sunshine. It's like, a little bit of sunshine, of course, is good for us, but
Right.
too much is like skin cancer and wrinkles, of course. Too much sugar, not a good thing, but, a little bit, if, it makes things more palatable and you get to eat those whole foods and they taste a wee bit better, that's okay. Now, talking about toxin makes me think of another buzzword, detox. Can we, in fact, detox ourselves, our foods? Can I detox somehow? That seems to be still pretty popular and hanging in there.
It really is. I've got to say, when I was in media, when I was at Good Housekeeping, I remember seeing a cover line that had detox on it and hearing that detox as a cover line was so popular for us at the magazine at Good Housekeeping, that it was something that no one wanted to get rid of because we knew that we were attracting new readers at the newsstand. And I found myself in this real kind of conundrum of thinking that there's absolutely zero science to say that there's any way to detox your body. Your gut, liver, and kidneys do that for you. So as long as those are functioning, then you're detoxing right now as you're listening to this podcast. The issue that we have is that when we hear and see words, the effective frequency of these things, the marketing of these things becomes that much more powerful the more we see them. So seeing something like detox on a cover line of Good Housekeeping, I wound up having to kind of shift my approach and say, okay, instead of telling you not to do this or begging my editor in chief and publisher to say to take this off because of the lack of accuracy, it was more about how can I deliver value once you actually buy this magazine and read my content in here that is under the detox story, but it's really about how, really a balanced, nutrient dense, whole food first approach to eating more nutritious foods more often, right? So it's ultimately, we have to find a way to give ourselves the ability to learn and be flexible and open to the idea that some things are marketing and some things can be positive marketing if they're treated as such. But we have to know the limit between what's positive, what brings us in to a topic or a subject matter versus what is actually the scientific validity of something.
We're talking to Jaclyn London, who's a registered dietitian, as I am as well. And we were just talking about detox being such a buzzword today. And, you mentioned how our bodies are equipped to detoxify. So I always think of it in terms of giving our bodies, as you just said, the tools it needs to do its job, whether it's drinking enough water, staying hydrated, having foods that are really nourishing all of our organs so they can do their job, not one food that's going to be your miracle detoxer. Now, Jaclyn on Instagram is very popular, and you need to follow her, Jaclyn London. And you take questions from the audience, which I love to see. And what have been some of the questions you've gotten recently?
You know what is fascinating, Carolyn, is that I feel like it kind of goes in waves every week. So I post a weekly Q&A on Fridays that I aim to answer on Fridays. It's been going into Saturdays, but I feel I need to change that up a little. But first of all, I love hearing from people because I love hearing what is on the mind of people, real people, right? More often, I feel like I do a little bit of patient work now, but it's not the main focus of my business today. So it winds up being a way for me to really connect with real people and hear about their questions and their struggles as it relates to nutrition and health. Every week seems to have a somewhat new theme, and it's not even intentional. Like it's clearly not something that's planned. It just seems like I get so many questions about specific supplements, like about one that has come up just about every week, but last week was particularly a high volume of questions about creatine. Lots of questions about creatine powder for women. It makes you think, who is the marketing engine behind creatine supplements for women, and when did this really go into full speed, right? Like how did we get here exactly? I get a lot of questions about probiotics and which probiotic should I take? Which protein powder do you recommend? So a lot of supplement questions, but mainly I get a lot of questions of, is XYZ true? Is it true that blah, blah, blah? And I could not appreciate that more, because I really feel like, first of all, as a dietitian, coming to us with a nutrition question is just so refreshing. Like an actual nutrition question versus, a product recommendation is ultimately our bread and butter. It's what we came here to do, right? So getting questions like that is always something that I find really satisfying and gratifying. But the questions about products do really illuminate something about the current power of marketing, particularly on social media platforms, and which products are pushing some sort of marketing effort at a specific moment in time. I've seen a lot recently also about colostrum, about bovine colostrum as a supplement. That's another one I get every week, many questions about colostrum. So there's a lot of confusion out there. There is also ultimately the underlying theme among questions from everyone that is just, how can I eat healthier for myself and for my family? And that's ultimately what most of us want to do.
I know protein is really the ultimate diet darling at the moment.
Mm.
Are people overdoing it? Do you think they're overdoing it? It's almost like
I'm so glad you said it like that. I think that's the perfect way to phrase this. It's exactly right. We're sucking the air out of the room. We've completely forgotten about fiber. Poor fiber. I mean, honestly, it was a little bit of a darling a couple of years ago, but now I feel like we have just replaced it. Everything is coming up protein. We've forgotten about healthy fats, and particularly, it's hard to even have a conversation about healthy fats without people screaming at you about seed oils. That's a whole other topic we can get to. But the fascinating thing about protein, I do get a ton of questions about protein, and I do think we're overdoing it, and not in a way that's harmful for us. I just think that what we're doing is pushing ourselves. I see this with women all the time. Women have been sold this bill of goods that the more protein you eat, the better it is for you, and period, right? Like, and that's it. That's the only thing. When ultimately, if you're full, you don't have to push yourself to eat more protein. That's a sign that you probably have eaten enough. Push yourself to eat more protein. That's a sign that you probably have eaten enough, right? So I think we've kind of yet again lost the forest from the trees. There is such a thing as too much, because ultimately any macronutrient in excess of what you need is going to ultimately lead to weight gain over time. It is true that it's harder to do with protein, and that's absolutely a fact. But it's a question of why are I'm seeing women everywhere pushing themselves to eat more protein when it's really okay. It's really okay to mostly eat more whole foods, to eat consistently throughout the day and choose a combo of foods so that you create the flavor and the satisfaction that you're really looking to get from your meals and snacks. And ultimately, just call it a day. We don't need to push more protein. You don't need an additional protein powder. Most likely, sometimes you do. Sometimes you might enjoy them. Sometimes they have a perfectly wonderful function. But the question of need versus could this be helpful to me, are two different things.
And I think just to kind of settle maybe on some numbers or guidance for folks today listening, is, I've heard like 30 grams of protein a
Mhm.
meal, space it out throughout the day. It's not a contest, folks, to say, I got 200 grams in today. Woohoo.
Right.
Tomorrow's another one. Because, like I said, you might be pushing out the other good stuff because your body needs all kinds of tools to do its job. And now we're hearing also about, of course, protein in beverages, not just
Mm.
milk, of course, which is a natural source of protein, but these beverages with benefits
Mhm.
also being promoted quite enthusiastically these days.
Carolyn, I feel like this has become my hobby horse. I can't help it. I don't know. I don't know how I don't know how I got here, but and I know that it's a controversial opinion among dietitians, because one of these brands has a kind of robust dietitian activation program. So I say this with complete respect for people who love these beverages. I think that this is a little bit misleading. I think the marketing around gut health as a functional beverage by adding fiber to a sparkling soda is a little bit misleading. It's not ultimately cultivating a more nutrient dense pattern of eating that helps you eat fiber and drink unsweetened beverages. That being said, if because some of these beverages are much lower in sugar, if you're trading them in for, if it's a direct swap for a sugar sweetened soda, absolutely there's a place for these. In fact, I'd say drink more of them. Like, I encourage people to drink them if that's what you like, if you like the flavor, and if you feel like you're tolerating them well, if they're not giving you gas, bloating, and any of the other unpleasant GI symptoms that can come along with those. It's just a question of this. If you're having added fiber, even if it's coming from a perfectly naturally occurring source, A, you're not learning how to eat more fiber from whole foods. And B, if you're automatically tacking on an additional, let's say 9 grams of protein and 9 grams of fiber rather, onto a meal. And let's say you're at Chipotle and you're having a Chipotle burrito and you've got, 20 grams, up to 20 grams of protein in that burrito, right? Because you've got veggies, you've got beans, which are super high in fiber. So there's a number of different fiber sources, and you're unknowingly consuming something because it, quote, supports gut health or supports healthy digestion, which is another kind of vague marketing term. Then are you really doing yourself any favors at that particular moment? Yes, I think we are all 95% of Americans aren't eating enough fiber. So yes, we do need to be eating more fiber, and we need to be finding new and creative ways to do it in our everyday lives. But I say eating for a reason, because ultimately you want that fiber to come gradually. You want to be increasing your fiber intake gradually, and you want to be doing it by increasing your hydration, by increasing the amount of water that you're drinking to avoid some of that GI discomfort. So if we increase fiber at a meal, we tack on an additional 9 grams, which is almost, a third of the daily value, then I worry that what we're doing is causing ourselves more of the gut health issues that we were looking to solve in the first place. And we're also making ourselves thirstier because the more fiber we have, the more water we're drawing into the GI tract.
Mm.
And ultimately, isn't the purpose of a beverage to help us hydrate?
Yeah, and if fiber is a necessary nutrient, there's more than one kind, right? We used
Right.
to talk about a tale of two fibers, meaning
Right.
soluble
Right.
and then insoluble. Insoluble meaning the kind of like the strings in celery, nature's broom to help clean you out, and then
Yes.
soluble fiber like in oatmeal, which may help with lowering, blood cholesterol. But some of these beverages and maybe other foods that are fortified or added to with a fiber, it might just be one kind of ingredient, right? You're not getting
Mm,
a family of fibers. So
yes.
let's think about this, folks. We don't just have one mineral or one vitamin. We don't just have one fiber. Okay. We've
Yes.
got a family of fibers. And again, as you just said, Jaclyn, very smartly, widen the net on your fiber. What do we talk about nutrition? Moderation, variety, and balance. I'm talking variety in
Mm,
our fibers, folks. Okay.
yes.
I'm going to, as we said before, nutrition myths, really are a tale as old as time. And I think way back when, and even before then, the snake oil salesmen that wound their way across the great American West with their snake oil, there was always a teeny kernel in every kind of a myth or any kind of a
Yeah.
thing. And I was reading about it, and it turned out that the Chinese, when they came to the great American West, maybe to help build the railroads and do other important things, they did come with their snake oil, and it was from water snakes that were in China. And they happen to be a good source of omega 3s. Okay. So the snake oil salesmen, they couldn't really get their water snakes from China. So they were getting it from the rattlesnakes, which actually are not a good source of omega 3. I know this is nerdy, but so cool. And so the water snakes, high in omega 3, as we know in modern nutrition science, omega 3 supports everything from inflammatory conditions, maybe even arthritis, certainly other really healthy heart health in our body. So maybe the Chinese had something going on there. But when the snake oil salesman took it from the rattlesnakes, and half the time they weren't even putting any snake in that stuff anyway, it might have been, whatever they were, like shaking up with some alcohol. So a little bit of kernel of truth, I guess, there, but extrapolating from what is true for, let's just face it, making some money.
I'm so glad you said this. And I'm so glad to have that history because I did not know that until this moment. And now you're making me want to go read. Carolyn, I feel like this is a book for you. I feel like this could be a book for you because this is like, I do feel like the history of this is so important. It really is still the exact same way today. I think of the perfect example of this, and I find myself talking about this more and more, which is something like the carnivore diet, which is being this is not a scientifically validated dietary approach, but it is very popular on social media and something that you find where when you look under any any big influencer, they're usually talking about meat, and more meat and raw milk, of course. And those of us in nutrition science are literally physically cringing because we're thinking, okay, long term, the risks of overconsumption of saturated fat can be really kind of catastrophic. Like they really can cause major health issues. Of course, not one steak. We're talking about only surviving on meat 365 days a year, right? The issue, though, that I see, the kind of dichotomy is that there is a benefit to a very short term elimination diet, elimination of all types of carbohydrates, essentially, because what you're looking to do is identify triggers and specific types of proteins that are also present in those carbohydrate containing foods. So a temporary maximum 2 weeks elimination diet can be so beneficial and useful for people. And so when I see people like us, like dietitians like us, completely dismissing these practices, I think, well, hang on a second. I completely understand the tendency. It was me. I've done it before myself. I'm not saying this from a judgmental place. I'm saying it more just from an alarm bells kind of place, which is that we're not listening to what people are actually experiencing. And if someone is experiencing some real intolerance to something or real discomfort from eating vegetables and fruit, then we need to find ways to work with them to make sure that we understand where they're coming from and understand why these elimination diets are working for a temporary period. The problem is that because we're not in these conversations and we're not seen as trustworthy sources, because we're not seen as people who really listen to what people are struggling with, we wind up missing out on the opportunity to help people and to actually educate them on what it might look like to reintegrate some of these more nutritious foods into their lives without feeling that discomfort.
And just to clarify, an elimination diet, folks, I mean, when you think about it, it's just sort of a clean slate. And
Mm.
so if you're having some issues, maybe you're not having issues, but for people who are having issues, it's that clean slate and then adding things back. And I was just thinking, when with infants and we have introducing foods one by one to
Yeah.
see how it's going to go. Maybe we're just, going back to that basic thing, which totally makes sense. We're winding down our discussion here with Jaclyn London, so famous for nutrition myth busting. I think you're going to be busy for a while. I wanted to share, when I was at CNN, I was a correspondent at CNN covering food and nutrition, and I may have interviewed a few hucksters in my time. But one of my favorites, and if you're listening, I'd like to know what you're up to, but there was a guy named Mitch Friedlander who's down in Fort Lauderdale, and he was actually in trouble, if you will, with the U.S. Postal System because for mail fraud, because this is back when you sold the dietary supplements or weight loss, ads in the back of a magazine.
That's
Speaking of
right.
magazines,
Mhm.
okay, you mail in your 1995 or whatever it was. Well, he had a supplement that was mostly guar gum, which is a
Mm.
gum. And in his promises were to folks that it would, of course, help you lose weight. But when you think about it, it kind of maybe it puffed up in the stomach, guar gum. It's a gummy kind of a fiber, so maybe a little truth in there, but apparently not to the U.S. Postal Service mail fraud people. And I remember that one of his slogans was "Eat all you want and still lose weight." And maybe you were full, so you were eating all you want and you still lost weight because you're eating less. So again, and I remember during our interview and back to the history and maybe the book that you're talking about,
Mm.
Jaclyn, he said to me in the interview, the CNN interview, well, what's the difference? I mean, Toyota says their marketing slogan is, "Oh, what a feeling." He goes, well, how can you prove that I get into a Toyota? But to wrap it up, it's
Mm.
completely different when you're talking about claims about products and services that impact our health.
Mm. So well said. I couldn't agree more. I think something else you said that I just want to highlight is when you mentioned that you're exactly right. You're so spot on that there's always this kernel of truth that is there, right? Because theoretically, if you were to consume enough guar gum, then you are going to be full. So you could eat technically all you wanted, but what you wanted was a lot less. This is how it works with some of the most sinister of them all, right? This is the tactic that is used by so many grifters. And I don't even think that it's an intentional use of a tactic. I think it's just they hear one kernel of information that is the accurate information. They may have heard it from some book or an actually credible expert or whatever it is, and they wind up using that to build an entire business. So I just think it really begs the good old catchphrase. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is.
Yeah, and again, as I always like to say, the more you know, the more you
Mm.
can eat. When you see a word you don't know what it is, look it up. If you really have lots of questions, of course, go to registered dietitians who have studied food and nutrition science and how what you eat and what you drink can really support long-term health goals and optimal health. So you look your best, you feel your best, and all those good things. And when you think about taking nutrition advice from folks who don't have a background, like a registered dietitian, I mean, would you go to a surgeon that hadn't gone to medical school? I don't think so. I really don't think so. And again, we're not piloting a plane, but we
Right.
do know about food, nutrition, and cuisine. Jaclyn, thank you so much for helping us digest, if you will, some of the ways, just to look at nutrition myths and just, be a little more cautious, folks, before, as we like to say on Watch What You Eat, we want to protect your body and your budget. Thanks so much. We'll have you back on as you keep your eyes on the prize of what you're busting out there on Instagram and other platforms. And everyone listening today, thank you so much. And you're always invited to add Watch What You Eat with Carolyn O'Neill to your podcast network.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. This was such a pleasure. I absolutely love chatting with you. I am here and ready to bust myths with you anytime. I really do feel like I could talk to you for forever. So thank you so much. Thanks for having me.